Right, so welcome everybody. I think sitting here it's a little bit cold. It's always a bit cold, especially on Thursday, because the heating goes off at 6, I think. If you come to other lectures, be prepared. But welcome here for the lecture of Bassem Saad, an artist, writer, born in Beirut, living in Berlin. Raised as an architect or trained as an architect, working with all kind of arts, film, performance, writing. Work I saw, I think more than a year ago, is the Congress of Eiling Persons. It's using performance techniques, Brechtian performance technique. It's a group of people performing themselves. It's a collective work, performing difficulties they face, a group of minorities, all kind of minorities. In the description, which I think it's a beautiful description, it's a cartograph of protest and crisis, working with migrants, with labor and Palestinian outsiders. And the film shows difficulties people are facing by colonialism, by exclusion, by all this kind of mechanism, imperialist mechanisms. I think these days, specifically now, an hour ago I read troops are entering Gaza. This feels suddenly like very urgent. And although it's very urgent and relevant, I think it's also a situation which is going on for a long time. And this kind of structures that are there, and I'm not sure if this is the part of being an architect to be capable of get a grip on certain structures, to have an interest in the fundamentals of society, and to think about how to rebuild society. But I think this is what was shown there. It's beautiful work. I saw it also in the presentation of Bassem. So maybe I don't speak too much, but wish you a lot of fun. And please give a very warm welcome to Bassem Saad.
Hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also quite intimidating that I feel like I'm presenting to a jury or something. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Belgium. Yeah, and I have a 45-minute presentation. Hopefully it won't take too much more than that. I wanted to start off by a little note to say that all lives are worthy of mourning everywhere, but mourning in public is also a decisive and political act. Today I would like to take a moment of silence to mourn the more than 7,000 Palestinian lives lost in Israel's assault on Gaza in the wake of October 7th. Free Palestine in our lifetime. And today, I have some slides from my recent film work, also from performance work that hopefully next year might be in ads or a version of it. Let's start. Okay. I have these two quotes from two very different writers that I sometimes start a presentation with. The first one is by Arwa Saleh, an Egyptian writer, feminist and communist, It's from her biography titled "The Stillborn: Notebooks of a Woman from the Student Movement Generation in Egypt." She was active in the 70s, primarily with the student movement and as well later in politics in different capacities. Enter the mythical circle of collective salvation. Worship its kitsch and madness beckons. You will not allow a word spoken against your piety. You refuse the human being as a world unto herself, alive with contradiction. And the second quotation I have is by Renata Adler, an American writer of fiction and a critic, who I largely wouldn't necessarily agree with, especially not in the quotation or generally in her politics, but I think the quote is interesting in context to the first one. There are times when every act, no matter how private or unconscious, becomes political. At other times, no act, no campaign or tract, statement or rampage has any political charge at all. People with the least sense of which times are and which are not political are usually most avid about politics. So it's to say that someone who can't really get with the times, or who can't really read the room, or who can't understand their situation, is to say that those people are the most avid about politics, as though it's a kind of naivete. And I find those two quotations interesting because the first one tries to reckon with the limits of politics once they approach the subjective, or once they approach interpersonal dynamics, maybe dynamics of gender, maybe dynamics of maybe more psychoanalytic dimension. And the second quotation somehow tries to say that politics is subjugated to a specific time, that there are times when there is a point in being political, and other times when there's absolutely no use in trying. And I think I like putting the two quotations in tension and to see where that interface between politics and other realms, how that manifests. And I have to deal with that often in my own artistic practice as someone whose work is described as political, which I think is obviously a kind of often shallow way of describing things. But yeah, I find it interesting to think of the limits between aesthetics and politics, and that is something that I am often grappling with. The first slide I have is a photo from 2015 from Beirut. In 2015, there was a kind of nationwide waste crisis. So there was garbage on the street, because everywhere on the streets, because one of the major landfills in the country was shut down, and there was no immediate plan for a backup. And so garbage flooded the streets, the waterways, both public and private places, and the population, the protesting contingents of the population took to burning the trash in the streets, both as a way of disposing of the trash and also as a way of protesting. And for me, that was definitely a very particular moment in my political consciousness. And so I often, when presenting, it was also the time when I started somehow moving from my own education into making artistic work. So I consider it a very particular and crucial moment. And it leads me to my second film, Kink Retrograde, which is a film that I made in 2019. This was 4 years after the start of the waste crisis, and in many ways, in 2015 the protests were called the Waste Revolts. You're getting a little dose of like Lebanese history here. But in 2015, the protests didn't really result in any kind of change, for better or worse. It was mainly this brief moment of political outburst, and then there was a continuation of the status quo. But I, in many ways, consider the protest that happened in 2015 as like a precursor to the uprising in 2019, which I would also get to in talking about Congress, the film that Godard briefly alluded to. King Retrograde, the first film I'm talking about, was shot in a landfill, in one of the landfills that opened up in the city, in Beirut. There is this practice in Lebanon that became a thing in the second half, towards the end of the 20th century, which is to basically throw garbage onto the coastline and then reclaim reclaim land from the sea through waste disposal. So it's this practice that happened after the war, because in Lebanon the war was between 1975 and 1990, and there was in the north of the city. I don't have a map in the slides, unfortunately, but in the north of the city there is now a really kind of fancy, luxurious waterfront, and in the past that used to be a great landfill that both halves of the city were connected to, and so afterwards that became really expensive real estate. And after the 2015 uprising, there were two landfills that were also got two new landfills that opened up, and they both got the same treatment, which is to dump garbage into the Mediterranean and then cordon it off, and later on it'll become expensive land. So I really wanted to shoot in this space, at a very particular kind of space. In a way, it looks very alive with plants and with very strange wildlife, but it is actually, of course, highly toxic. And so the film, I was really interested in having my friend Ryan sort of perform these gestures of self-care that kind of do a kind of yoga exercises, do some kind of play with the water, and have that be a kind of joke about the environmental effect. And the premise of why there is this idea of kink, or why it's called Kink Retrograde, is that there was this idea in the film that this fictional narrative that what if there was this group of people, like a kind of circle of friends or a circle of loosely organized individuals, who decide that the status quo or the social contract between themselves and the state is morally bankrupt, or it doesn't work, because there is a lot of risk that everyone is involved to that they never consent to. So there is risk in the environment, through environmental toxicity, that you never fully are aware of and you never consent to it. And it makes the contract that you have with the state void. So it makes the contract completely useless. And the idea was, what if you could think of kink? I mean, kink like sexual kink, or BDSM, or different kinds of sexual practices involve often a kind of contract between practitioners. So people will say, I acknowledge that this activity is risky, but I accept to undertake it, and there are certain parameters, like safe words, like it's mainly contracts between individuals who are engaging in a risky activity together. And the idea was to say, what if those kinds of contracts could be applied to how individuals engage with each other and with whatever kind of governing, ostensibly or supposedly democratic body that they participate in. And I'll play a small clip of the film.
They kept extensive accounts of relevant average durations, half-lives, and contracts. 11 years, biological half-life of dioxin in a human. 1 hour, biological half-life of cocaine in a human. 25 years, average initial contract for an incinerator facility. 2 years, starting duration of a domestic work contract under the kafala system. 70 to 100 years, the average lifespan of a residential building unit, built with a windowless maid's room smaller than 5 meters squared. 50.6 years, lowest national life expectancy worldwide this year. 89.3 years, highest national life expectancy worldwide this year, Monaco. Minus 20 years, the change in Syrian national life expectancy between 2010 and 2014, the result of a war which began against an ecological backdrop of perennially increasing drought. The same war that has in turn poisoned bodies of water through chemical warfare, after which the nation has been rebuilding with a smaller but more homogeneous population, a prospect planners in Beirut, Beijing, and elsewhere eagerly looked forward to. 11 years, the average time between global market crashes since 1987, a period now referred to as the long counter-revolution, a thought which may or may not provide momentary solace.
The photos here of they're kind of taken, they're shot from the sea and looking back onto the city and onto the mountains behind Beirut. So you see kind of the different layers from the water, the garbage, and then the city behind it. And the idea in the first part of the clip was to have this overlay between different durations of contracts. So have like the durations of a lifetime, the average national lifetime, so thinking of the individual in relation to the nation, and then thinking of like these different types of contracts for labor, and as well the half-life of substances in a human body. Yeah, and that was and the film I made it back then in 2019, but then in 2022 last year I made a re-edit of it. So the voiceover you hear in this clip is the layer that was changed when I re-edited the film, and I did that because I felt like the way I was approaching filmmaking changed quite a bit after certain events in the time between 2019 and 2022, and some of them are addressed in Congress. The second film, Congress of Idling Persons, is, as Godard described it, it is a kind of collectively scripted work. So my approach there was to move away from my own voice or my own kind of having just my writing be the basis of the film, and to kind of figure out a methodology for working with other individuals to have them be participants in the film in a way where they are not documentary subjects in a traditional sense, even though of course they are that, but also have them be closer to participants in the aesthetic and the writing and artistic choices in the film. So it was a kind of decision to work with. I'll go back to these slides. It was a decision to work with 4 individuals in Beirut that I kind of experienced these different political events alongside of. And when I say events, I mean the Lebanese uprising at the end of 2019, the pandemic, of course, the George Floyd protests in 2020 in New York. I happened to be in New York in the first 7 months of 2020, and that's when the protests happened. And it was right after I had been in Beirut for the uprising in Lebanon. And then I go to New York, the protests happened, the pandemic also happens before that. And then I returned to Beirut a few days before the explosion, the explosion in the Beirut port. So it was obviously a very kind of difficult and challenging and a very dissonance causing time. And I decided that there was no way I could go about making the film by having purely my own voice or my own kind of, or myself as a character only in the film. So it was my first attempt at working with other individuals as like speakers in a work. And Marianne and Sandy, they're 2 of the 4 individuals. They're my friends that I kind of spent a lot of time with during the protests. Islam is a 3rd generation Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, writer, feminist, an activist. She has a lot of experience organizing in Palestinian camps in Lebanon and working in the non-profit sector in Palestinian camps in Beirut. Mekdes, who is a migrant worker, Ethiopian migrant worker, and organizer as well. She's a co-founder of Enyalenya, a feminist mutual aid network. It's one of the few organizations in the country that is run by non-Lebanese people working in an anti-racist mode towards the abolition of the sponsorship system for migrant labor, which is called the kafala system. It's a very kind of egregious and abhorrent system for migrant work through which a lot of workers come to the country and then have their passports confiscated by their sponsors. So there always needs to be a Lebanese sponsor who ends up being almost your kind of custodian. And so a lot of people are working against that system. And the 4 individuals and myself, I think everyone tries to approach their own perception and experience of the protests in Lebanon and the explosion, and even the more internationalist echoes and reverberations of the Black Lives Matter movement, and which coincides around the same time as the other 2 events. And the film combines those shots with the individuals, with my own kind of voice in the film, which is through the on-screen text in both Arabic and English. There is a kind of, I really was trying to kind of create this snapshot of struggle. So try to have a kind of documentary practice and to document how people were thinking and reacting and dealing with these different events, but at the same time also allow room for some formal play in how the different characters approach their own scripts. So the documentary or the film really works against a kind of naturalistic depiction. So my goal was specifically not to have a very, let's say, raw or unfiltered performance on screen, but I wanted to spend time with the different individuals working towards writing the script together. So some of them wrote their own script and read it, some of them we had different meetings and then we did some improvisation, and and sometimes it was also based on questions that I would ask. So there's an attempt in the film at making the relationship between myself and the different performers as I wanted to acknowledge it as much as possible and not try to obscure it by kind of forcing any kind of neutrality or pretending to have a different relationship. Because I was also experiencing those events myself, so I had a personal stake in that as well. Cut to a clip.
ليلة اللي سمعنا خبر النبض تحت الركام من بعد الانفجار يعني، وليلتها انه كنت يا بقعد بالبيت ببكي يا بنزل بتسكع تحت على قد ما في اقدم وجودي، يعني انه لعل وعسى صار شيء او بين شيء يعني
بوقتها كان الكلب تشيليه فلاشي اللي لاقت النبض،
هو انه بليلتها انه 90% رطوبه وهي موجوده
ونحن كنا كتير عطشانين، ما في ولا دكانه فاتحه، وكانت فلاش عم تتدلع وتتصور وتشرب مي وتاكل وصبات فلاش، وفلاش هي الدوله، الكلبه هي الدوله. كان في هيك نوع من انه ايمان بفلاش، وايمان بانه اكيد في ولد صغير تحت هيدا الردم، هيدا الولد اللي ببيع ورود تخبى تحت هاي البنايه.
When asked as a child by a statistician, I remember saying something in earnest along the lines of how I would one day liberate Palestine. When I started volunteering and teaching students, I helped them conduct the same survey process. I learned that my students' answers were very different from my own. They were dreaming of having actual careers. Becoming a doctor was almost impossible in Lebanon, yet it seemed more probable to them than liberating Palestine or even dreaming of doing so. According to Jana statistics, fewer and fewer students have chosen to liberate Palestine as their end goal since 2007. And I would be lying if I said that this shift doesn't terrify me. What once was a collective imaginary becomes an individual choice. When you are not positioned as an actor with power or agency, you may choose to be politically active. In the early 70s, people demanded the democratization of UNRWA. They led strikes and protests because they wanted it to be a people's organization. Yet they were silenced, similar to how they were silenced in
I remember
2016 and
seeing a man
2019, carrying a flyer that said, "Do not turn us into terrorists." And that line has stayed with me.
كانت بحلم حلم شي بخوف. حلم هي بكون مطرح كتير حلوة، بكون عادي مع ناس حوالي كتير حلو.
Yeah, that clip is from almost towards the end of the film. And you could maybe notice there are moments when the sound and the image kind of stop being synchronized, and that was a kind of very central way of editing and trying to have sort of different takes of the same scene overlaid onto each other to see also the slippages in how each of the characters was performing their roles, and to see kind of the same thought articulated in different ways. The idea of the Congress as well, I mean, it's called Congress of Idling Persons. The idea of idleness was very interesting in the film. It was to think of how it was that both in Beirut and in New York, the moments of protest were preceded by either long-term or immediate moments of mass unemployment, and to think of this idea of non-productivity and how like the individuals in the film are very active in many ways, they're very politically active, but they often are experiencing this cessation of labor or business as usual. And there was also quite a bit of focus on the film and how the riot, which is a form of protest that becomes is considered illegitimate because it becomes violent or because there's damage to private property. So there are shots of it's not in the clip, but there's shots in the film of like looting and stealing from different stores in Beirut, in Solidar, in this private downtown district, and also privatized downtown district, and also in Soho in New York. And I like going back to the original Guy Debord quote, which was I mean, when the George Floyd protests happened, there was a lot of discussion of the Watts riots, which were these violent riots in black majority neighborhoods in Watts in the United States. And I'll read out this line. Looting is a natural response to the unnatural and inhuman society of commodity of violence. It instantly undermines the commodity as such, and it also exposes what the commodity ultimately implies: the army, the police, and the other specialized detachments of the state's monopoly of armed violence. The Watts youth, having no future in market terms, grasped another quality of the present, and that quality was so incontestable and irresistible that it drew in the whole population: women, children, and even sociologists who happened to be on the scene. And of course, he means the spectacle, and I won't get into like the idea of the spectacle, but for me it was interesting to talk about damage to private property as a form of violence that arises in some forms of protest, and how that becomes a way to delegitimize different movements, and how the riot in a way is the opposite of a Congress, because Congress is somehow the most legitimate form of assembly. It's the most high on the hierarchy of in a democratic or parliamentary society. And for me, it was interesting to have the riot and the Congress as these two archetypal opposites. So that was kind of conceptually, that was how I was thinking of the different voices in the film. I'm doing on time, maybe like 15 minutes more, right? Something like that. Yeah, I'll move to this. I've been doing this visual this project that's not film, but is this kind of photography project and also textual exercise. The project is called the project is called Suppose That Rome Is Not a Human Habitation, and the title is taken from this passage by Freud, by Sigmund Freud, in Civilization and Its Discontents, where he tries to imagine, he kind of proposes this metaphor where the brain or the human mind is similar to a city, in that, and specifically Rome, because Rome is known for its historical layers, for its status as a center of empire, a center of a slave society as well. And he has this idea of what if the brain maintained different traces in its archaeology, and he's trying to describe the unconscious. And he makes this analogy between a brain and a city. And he says, the observer would perhaps only have to change the direction of his glance or his position in order to call up the one view or the other. But then he quickly says, actually, no, like this doesn't work. This is, it's not so simple. It's also kind of, you can't just place different memories on top of each other in your mind, like the city does the layers of archaeology. So he presents this metaphor and then he quickly retires it. But for me, something was interesting, and I found, the medium of the lenticular, it's this kind of print where different images are imposed on the same surface. So you see one image by changing your viewing angle. And I found it, I was kind of drawn to the medium, and I thought it could be an interesting way of approaching photography so as to have these different frames from, it's almost like a small scene in a film where there's like different shots with some text. So for me, it's like very continuous with how I approach film. What you're seeing here is like 3 slides, or the 3 images in one lenticular. So there's a center image and there's 2 side images, and the text changes based on where you stand, and the image changes as well. So it's also this kind of exercise of poetry in space, because you have to move around to see the verse, the lines. And it's like, for me, something is happening here that also, as I try to work in my film, goes against a naturalistic documentary portrayal of an object or of a site, because at the end of the day, I am projecting my own text onto these images, and they are not, they're being presented with a very specific purpose in mind. And all the images in the series are, here you can see some of the text. I'll talk about it a bit more, but some of the, what unites the different sites or objects that are portrayed in the photos is their status as being on the edge of the city or the nation, or the wage relation. The wage relation being any kind of productive activity where someone receives money in exchange for their labor. So the different sites, like for example, this site in the middle is a lake in Berlin, in the north of Berlin, called Flughafensee. And to get to this lake, when you take the train and you get off the station, you have to walk in parallel to the walls of a prison. So there is this prison, the Tegel prison, and it's like, for me, like there's something so alienating and jarring about this idea of going to a lake and like aiming for this kind of very pleasant afternoon or day or whatever, and then having to walk near a prison. and something about it, like it's on the edge of the city. It's also the site of leisure, but also the site of ultimately subjugation of individuals who are considered punishable by law. And for me, I thought that's an interesting kind of or a worthy site to portray in this manner. And what the text does is it tries to approach different occupants of the city, like different individuals in the city in their different roles as types of individuals who are deemed disposable or imprisonable or who are deemed unnecessary for the functioning of society and are liable to end up in prison. And other kinds of individuals who may experience the site with leisure and with family time and with time with friends. So that was kind of what I was trying to do with the text and what the juxtaposition of the different images is attempting. Another the second print in the series has in the middle this image from the temple of Poseidon in Greece, and on the sides there is the remnants of an archaeological border wall. It's in the north of Lebanon. So the center is the image in the center is from Greece. The images on the side are from Lebanon, from the northern coast in Lebanon, and a Phoenician border wall. So again, like these edges of the city. And what the text is trying to do here is to think of this more recent history, recent but also more long-standing history of migration in the Eastern Mediterranean between Lebanon, Syria, and different Arab countries or different countries outside of Europe, and then the migration from there into Europe, and how some of the routes of these migrations, like some of the migrant ships, also overlap with more like very touristic routes, especially in Greece with like the Aegean and the myth of these islands that are full of just like beauty and eroticism. And so the idea for me was to juxtapose these sites and try to channel that kind of very schizoid or very kind of split imagining. Yeah, that's the second one. And the third is it is this the image, the objects in the center are these objects that I found in. I mean, this is, I made this print in Marseille because I had an exhibition in Marseille, and I was able to spend some time there. And in the middle there are these objects that I found in the museum. So over there you see the Museum of Mediterranean Civilizations, the MUSEM, which is this big kind of city sponsored museum of objects of anthropological interest. So any kind of objects that are from medieval arts and crafts up to the present day, any objects that are deemed interesting for anthropological reasons. And I found the objects in the center. I found out later, I mean, when I visited the archives of the museum, that they are collected from prisoners when the city of Marseille was renovating the prison, which is portrayed here, the Beaumet prison. It's one of the kind of the most, it's probably the most infamous prison in France, known for having like also a great population of like people from the former colonies, a lot of Algerian and also a lot of black people, French black people. And for me, what was so jarring as well is that these objects, they look like, from observation, you can tell that they're not so old, that they're probably from the 2010s or from the last 10 or 20 years or so, but and I mean, they were confiscated at the move, which I forget the date of it, because they were moving prisoners from one part of the prison to another. And the idea for me was that they're already in a museum, but the people to which they have been the people that they have been confiscated from are most probably still in the prison. And for me, there was this kind of, I wanted to address through the work, this idea of memorialization, or kind of putting an object in a museum when the struggle to which it is attached to is still ongoing. So kind of having this historicization, instant history of the present that comes too soon somehow, or it comes before something is really concluded. Yeah, so that was the third in the series, and yeah, here's a close-up. So you see here, like, some of the text there overlaps with this writing, which just says "vivre" on one of these objects. Yeah, and so again, like thinking of the city and how a certain event or a site is experienced very differently by different individuals in the same geographic space, and thinking of like how individuals in space are have very different kind of life worlds or worldviews. Yeah, and finally, I won't present too much about this project. This is a performance project between myself and a friend of mine, Sanja Grosdanic, who is a writer. The performance is called Permanent Trespass, Beirut of the Balkans and the American Century. And our starting point was this idea of Sanja is Bosnian, and she grew up in Australia because her family was displaced during the Bosnian War. And we both kind of fixated on this idea of Sarajevo in Bosnia being called the Beirut of the Balkans at some point in the 90s, because the war in Lebanon ended in 1990, and then instantly, right after that, the war in Bosnia, the war in the Balkans began. And so Bosnia took on this idea of being Beirut of the Balkans. And so we started from there, and then we started looking at different instances of literature that comes out of what is referred to as post-conflict societies, or societies after conflict. Conflict, of course, being a phrase that, for me, obscures more than it reveals. That is obviously very relevant in relation to Palestine. This idea of like the conflict in the Middle East. But yeah, we started from this looking at different writers and different practices of thinking of war and historical injustice through writing. And then now in the performance, we perform the role of these two eulogists, like these two people who are invited to give a professional eulogy, or like a professional mourning, like as though someone's at a funeral and someone's invited to talk about them. And so then we meet each other and we start discussing, and the premise of it is that we're meeting at the end of the American century. The American century being the period of time from like the end of the Second World War up until the present. I mean, there are different moments in time when people start to say the American century is ending, or like American hegemony is ending, and then it continues in more zombified forms. Yeah, and so that was kind of the starting point for us. And also there's quite a bit of references to the German context, because we both live in Germany, we both live in Berlin, and our meeting point was in Germany. So we try to kind of understand how our different these different histories are understood in Europe, how they're understood in Germany, how especially Germany being a very kind of place that has a lot of emphasis on remembrance and acknowledgement of past atrocity with the Second World War and the Holocaust, and how that is a central structuring principle of national discourse, especially after the reunification of East and West Germany. Yeah, so that is, we're hoping to maybe work on this project a bit more next year, maybe here in Belgium. Yeah, and that's what I'll present about today. You're welcome to ask questions, or we can chat also off the record, whatever interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
Are there any questions?
I feel like it's also, I mean, I am showing film works, but you can't really watch the film, so I know that it's kind of annoying, because it's like, you can't really, you can just judge by the clip that you see, but hopefully, if anyone is really interested, I can also send viewing links. But yeah.
Maybe I have a question. Like watching your work, also before, like it's very. On one side, it's very research based. There is a lot of research, and there are a lot of different layers. Actually, it is this this Freudian metaphor about a city. I think like you bring all these things together. And at the same time, it's also very spontaneous and it feels very natural. And I think, like specifically in Congress of idling people, persons. There is a lot of research behind it. Like you feel these layers. Then there is a lot of autonomy by the people you're working with. Like it's almost a collective work, and then there is also a music producer joining. Like the team is enormous.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can maybe say something about, on one hand, having this this research, then this kind of spontaneous collaboration with people. Like how does this start? Is it starting with the people, starting with this research?
I mean, the project actually started with a lot more research than really ends up in the film in the end. Like in the end, I think there's a lot of recounting of direct first-hand experience on my part and also on the part of the different characters. I had first written it as a kind of lecture performance, so I had written a script for most of it that had way more, in a way, more like historical research or more theoretical research, and then I knew the different individuals like before deciding to make the film. Like I just knew them from some of them I had been close friends with for a long time, some of them I had met in different political spaces in Beirut, like whether I had met Mekdes at the Migrant Community Center in Beirut, which is this center for it's run by Lebanese nationals, but it's part of the anti-racism movement, and it's a space where there's a lot of different classes that migrant workers can take if they decide that it's interesting for them to develop skills outside of the ones required of them through work, and just a kind of skill building and a space for exchange and convivial time. And then afterwards I realized that she was one of the co-founders of the space. She was in a class that I was kind of volunteering, was giving English classes at the Migrant Community Center. With Islam, I just knew her from around, we knew each other online, and also we had encountered each other a lot in different protests. And then the idea was to there's a very traditional filmmaker documentary subject relationship. I'm making a film, I want to invite you, I want you to perform in this film. But on the other hand, there's this attempt together through different sessions to work on a script together, and I try to say, okay, yes, I want you to speak about actual events, but I also want you to perform some kind of role that I don't want you to feel like you have to perform exactly yourself. You can kind of, we can explore a bit more what you're wearing, or how the performativity, what kind of tone there is in the film, what kind of character we're building through the sets and props and the wardrobe. And so there is this idea to work together on the scene and to devise something that is more aesthetically interesting for me than to have like just like a documentary in a random space and with the talking and like ultimately they are talking heads, but there's something a bit more to them, you know. There's like either strange props. I mean, Sandy and Ryan, Sandy, who as you mentioned, Sandy Sharon is also a musical producer and a musical artist. So she has her own dialogue in the film, but she also she had also made an EP, an album for kind of like in the reflecting on this moment of unrest and protest in the city. So the song at the end of the film is by her, and her own dialogue moves from her character into the lyrics of the song. And I found that to be like a really kind of interesting occasion to have this overlap between her artistic work and my artistic work as well, and have a part of the song feature in the work. Yeah, so I was lucky in the sense that we had all experienced these events together, and there was this desire to participate in making a film. It doesn't happen often. Like I can't really extrapolate from this film to other projects. The way it happens now is I either know someone and we have an interest in working together, and then we start writing together, like with the project with Sanya, Permanent Trespass. Yeah, so it's kind of it's very case by case, I would say, but I try to like get a budget so I can pay people, and but I would also hope that they're interested in the project beyond just like the compensation, and that there's like an attempt at making a work together. But at the same time, I'm also clear that ultimately I want to always acknowledge the real like economic basis of a work. Like I'm the artist, I'm gonna circulate it under my name somehow. Like authorship and ownership are, you know, like there are certain limitations to them. So for me, it's interesting to work within the limitations and outside of them, and try to just like respond to the constraints and try to work beyond them. Yeah.
Yeah, to me, it seems like you have two different methodologies side by side. With lenticulars, for example, you really start from a very particular context that for me seems very much research based or like site specific, like the Marseille lenticular, for example. But then with the two films that you showed, you have a very like comparative methodology. You don't like zoom in on one specific event, but you like bring different events together, which for me is super interesting because it like shows the sort of connections between different communities and how to deal with specific events in different parts of the world, or like historical moments. And I was wondering if you could say something more about that, like how these lenticulars might relate to this other methodology where you have this more comparative strategy.
Yeah, I mean, with the lenticulars, I mean, for me, what's also interesting about the lenticulars is this idea of the flaneur or the flaneuse, like this figure that roams in the city and like is very melancholic and starts thinking of like these different histories in the city and like the textures and sounds and sights, and obviously like as an artist like walking around the city, I like embody that role as well. But I'm always pushing like against the limits of that role, and how that role, like if you only limit yourself to this kind of whimsical approach to the city, you're going to be stuck in the immediate kind of surface of the city. And the idea in this work is to kind of look also beyond the surface, which is beyond just like what the image presents, but try to like even allow for the subjective reading of like my own subjective reading, kind of allow it into the canvas. And so in a way, it is like it also like most of my work also is guided by my own life experiences somehow. Like I was invited to Marseille, and so then I'll if I find it interesting, or I find that I have the baggage or like the political understanding or the historical understanding to engage with the site, then I'll try to do that. If not, then I'll just stick to what I know. Yeah, and that like that's with the lenticulars, but with the films, I mean, that's the thing. I also like with this idea of research. Like I also find it tricky. Like I find it when artists are described as like research based. I don't really know what that means because I'm like everything's research. Like reading an article on your phone is research, or like talking to people, or participating in a collective. Like that's also research. So oftentimes when like I hear someone talk about their work as anyway, I feel like that moment in contemporary art has passed somehow. Like I don't see that happen so much, but it was like definitely like an early 2010s thing, or like between 2000 and 2010. I feel like people who really were talking about the work as research based, and then like and I do think of it as like a symptom somehow. Like I think of it as like that's because politically things were different somehow, but now I feel like I am too caught up in like generally like the politics that I'm experiencing in my day-to-day life to have a kind of research interest that's more isolated from my own direct life experiences, you know? So I feel like generally I haven't been pursuing projects that are like would take me out of my own day-to-day life for a longer period of time. I feel like I'm always trying to pursue projects where I can be like very grounded in my day-to-day life, and also where like what I'm already doing is it informs the artistic practice. You get me? Like where like I don't have to like remove myself from one place to another to do the work, but it's more like it's continuous a bit, at least in terms of the experiences that govern the project. Yeah, I don't know if that made a lot of sense.
Yeah. But for me, it's super interesting this comparative approach, because you often get to critique like focusing on one situation, and like this week, for example, what was happening in Palestine, like we got a comment, why focus on this event and not on the earthquake in
Palestine? Yeah.
Yes, but I think like it's strange to like focus on one situation, because within this period of time everything is interconnected, and I think like this is also what you try to achieve within your films, to like seek out the connections and the sort of parallels, and I think that's much more interesting than like zooming in on one situation. And this was interesting for me, and the lenticulars also, but these were like for me a completely different approach, like dealing more with this sort of site specificity and responding more to a situation.
Yeah, I mean for me also like the more recent work that I'm doing is I'm also acknowledging that, I mean I moved to Berlin in 2021. And before that, I was like living in Beirut. Most of my work was dealing strictly almost with events coming out of Beirut. And then when I moved to Berlin, I'm still in this period of like accepting and recognizing that I now live in a different place, that like my work, I'm not so interested in like going back to Lebanon to do my research and then to present it in Europe. You know, like that model I'm not interested in at all. Because I also feel like it'll lead me to, I mean, of course, like if I feel like something is really, if there's a specific kind of urge that I think makes sense, I would of course like to go back and work in Beirut for sure. That's always on the table. But I mean, I really wanted to accept that I now live in a different place and try to, especially with these newer projects, with projects that I'm starting to work on, to kind of not have this idea of presenting work. I mean, I'm also like I'm aware of where my work circulates. Okay, like I get invited to different institutions in Europe and different European cities. I present my work, and then I want to make sure that the work is not read as like a documentation of catastrophe elsewhere, you know, or like, oh, like here I am presenting something about Beirut, and then like the audience feels comfortable that there's like a safe distance, like that kind of distance I'm interested in challenging. Or like, that's why I was like, I want to make this work about a Berlin-based site. Also, like, what was interesting is that the prison here, I found out later, was the site of the largest prisoners union in Germany, and that the prisoners were able to negotiate receiving the same minimum wage that you receive outside of prison for the labor that they're doing inside prison. And so for me, that was like like I didn't even know, like I was surprised, and I realized that most of the people that I spoke to in Berlin who go to this place also didn't know about this. And so I was like, I felt like that's a really interesting point. And so the text in one of the places, the name of the prisoners union comes up. Yeah, but I'm always interested in challenging this kind of distance between, because yeah, like I'm also aware of who my audience ends up being often in contemporary art, and I'm interested in like not building a kind of like really emphasizing the interconnectivity and emphasizing a kind of internationalism of thought in the work. Yeah.
More questions? Okay.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know if it's a question. Well, probably yeah, it's a question. I really find like, do you think that your medium kind of changed with you leaving Beirut? I mean, do you feel like your observational status kind of changed? Because I really feel I can relate to it, but at the same time, I feel that the narrative actually was there when we were living in Beirut, and we were kind of always recycling and repushing and re-looking at things from a different perspective. But at the same time now, especially because it's lenticular and it's literally based on movement and based on your position, I really find it interesting how you saw things where other people won't actually see. And I don't know if you can say something about that, because I really, like when you first look at it without the context, it would be anyone walking in Marseille or walking anywhere. And then when you re-look at it or redo the same thing that you've been doing in Beirut, the practice of it on that medium itself, it reissues or regenerates something interesting. But I don't know if you can say something, or is it, I mean, is that conscious?
I think, yeah, like you're very right in pointing out, like ever since I moved to Germany, I definitely haven't felt comfortable starting a new film project, you know, like I also feel like in Beirut, I was making films with like I made 3 films in Beirut, so there's a film before these 2 that I made that they're all like really almost zero budget, like it's like finding a camera and then shooting. And in Congress, whenever there's other people involved, I try to offer some kind of payment. But generally, like in Beirut, I felt like I could really somehow produce things with like no budget, whereas that feels so impossible in Europe. So I'm always trying to survive myself. So I feel like kind of going towards this. I mean, now hopefully I'll be able to get back to making film, but I feel like. The lenticular is also, like definitely in my relationship to the city, it's more like, even in Marseille or even in Berlin, like I feel like a passerby or a visitor, you know, like I'm trying to also be, to embrace a kind of humility in how much I know of the context. Like now I feel more comfortable maybe making a film that's set in Berlin and dealing with other characters, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do. And I have I'm lucky to have found to be able to work with a friend of mine who is Berlin based and is German, and like we kind of have a good collaboration. So now we're really interested in making a film work together. But before then, I definitely didn't feel like neither economically nor in terms of subject position, in terms of like to make a film in Berlin. Yeah, but now I feel like, especially now in this current moment of crackdown on like with like anti-Arab, Islamophobic, anti-Palestinian kind of sentiment really flaring up in Germany and in the rest of Europe. I feel like now I feel kind of like called on to like there. No, but I feel like there's like a moment in which my own experiences or historical understandings allow me to like enter into a kind of national discourse or something. So yeah, with the project that we're starting on now, we were already starting to work on it, this new film work, that I didn't talk about. So it's something else. But now the current moment, it feels like a good starting point to start working on it. But yeah, like for sure, what you're seeing here is like these 2.5 years of like acclimating to not being in the city where I was born and raised and know almost every street or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know, but you can relate.
Cool. Thanks.
Any more questions? Maybe it's a moment to go to the bar and continue the discussion there. But not before we put our hands together one more time. Thank you.